Good morning to our participants and attendees. My name is Dr. Tamara Lee. I'm a professor at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and I have been engaged in Cuba research for over 15 years now. Started as a student lawyer or a law student, and now I do academic research in Cuba involving worker participation. I want to welcome everyone to this extremely critical briefing organized by ACERE. ACERE stands for the Alliance for Cuba Engagement and Respect. It was created in 2020 to push Congress for an urgent easing of sanctions against the island and to help Cubans confront the economic crisis caused by necessary health measures taken during the pandemic. Now, we are all here, of course, because of the extraordinary events and recent events that took place in Cuba this week on July 11th. But I am here to argue that those events must be historically contextualized and considered within the complexities of long-running geopolitical events that have taken place over the decades, including the relationship between the US and Cuban governments and exogenous shocks in the form of regional foreign policy, global economic crises, natural disasters, and of course, the ongoing pandemic that we're facing as an entire globe. We have a distinguished group of US-based experts from the activist, practitioner, and policy worlds that we've assembled for storytelling and also for counter narratives. And I will yield most of our time to their commentary. I will reserve 15 minutes, however, for Q&A before we wrap up. You can start typing those questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to all or as many as we can later in the program. I expect this dialogue to be as passionate, intelligent, and multifaceted as the Cuban people who are directly impacted by the governments and policies that we will discuss. But to set the complexity of the conversation, I have thought of several overarching questions that I think anybody in the US should ask themselves before we start talking about what Cuba needs to do or what needs to be done in Cuba. The first one is, what do Cubans want? And by that, I want us all to ask ourselves, whose voices are we centering? And are those voices truly representative of the civil society as a whole? What does the content analysis of their recent protestation set as their demands? What is it that they're actually saying are their demands? And it is my academic perspective that it's the same as it has been for very many decades, which is that these are inherently economic when we get down to it. But we have a panelist here that is really going to delve into that. The second question is, what is the geopolitical context for this contestation? What impact has US foreign policy had on Cuban domestic policy? How much of the current conditions that are named by the protesters due to the very globally unpopular US embargo versus what I have spoken to some Cubans about, which they call the Cuban embargo, meaning their government's response to the economic challenges. And part of the geopolitical context then is, what is the role of the US government in the creation, the maintenance, the escalation, in the lack of material resources that have been explicitly named by the protesters as problematic. And then the third question, depending on how you answer the first two, is what is the role, if any, of the US in aiding the Cuban people at this moment? Right? This, in my opinion, is the simplest question based on theory and research and personal stories, which is the major consensus, no matter where people are on the political scale, is that they want to end the US embargo. Okay, so with those guiding frameworks, I'm going to turn the discussion over to our speakers, who will take us through their understandings of what Cubans want, what role the US has played in current conditions, and how the US should respond to the Cuban people's demands. Our first speaker is going to be Carlos Lazo. Carlos is a Cuban-American teacher based in Seattle who is the founder of Puentes de Amor, or Bridges of Love, an organization dedicated to promoting the normalization of relations between the US and Cuba and support for Cuban families. Carlos began organizing monthly caravans in cities across the US this year to call attention to the embargo and to call on the US to lift all sanctions against Cuba. The caravans have now gone worldwide, and Carlos is currently joining us from his walk along with 6 other Cuban Americans, 2,000 miles from Miami to Washington, D.C., to call on Congress and President Biden to lift the embargo. Carlos, please take your 7 minutes of very important dialogue.
Well, I'm gonna try to be brief. First of all, thank you to everyone who is here today. As you said, my name is Carlos Lazo. I'm a Cuban American. I have lived in the United States for the last 28 years. I live in Cuba for 28 years too. I consider Cuba, and I always say this, to be my mother and the United States to be my father, because I'm so grateful to both countries and both communities for where I am right now. I left Cuba looking for freedoms and opportunities. The first time that I tried to leave Cuba, I was sent to jail because I tried to leave illegally. The second time I reached the coast of the United States, and since then I have been here. I lived in Miami for a while, then I moved to Seattle. In Seattle, I became a combat medic for the US Army. I ended up going to the Iraq War. I'm a decorated veteran in the Battle of Fallujah, a combat medic. I serve very proudly my country. The first time that I have a situation how these policies affect people is when I came back from Iraq in 2005. Some of the congressmen and senators that are still around maybe remember this. I remember Rosa DeLauro that was aware about my case, Barbara Lee, Congressman McGovern, many others. I tried to visit my children in Cuba. At that time, they live over there, and the administration prevent me from going over there because during that time, the Bush administration implemented policies that prevent Cuban Americans from visiting Cuba just once every 3 years. And I start voicing my concern, the concern of many Cuban Americans who couldn't go even to the funeral of their mother if their mother passed away because they have to fulfill this unhuman policy of 3 years stop from going to Cuba. I even end up in 2007 testifying in the US Senate in this regard. Years later, the policies changed. President Obama came. I became a teacher. I teach at the University of Washington. Then I teach in public schools. And during my time teaching, I took students to Cuba through the program that was allowed on the Treasury for visiting educational exchange. And that was the first time that I experienced what I call breaches of love, because the contact between regular Cubans and Americans of all backgrounds showed me that the way to go here was through the contacts, to bring into Cuba the best of our values and teaching Cubans about the values of our communities, but at the same time learning about the Cuban society, about the Cuban people. During the Trump administration, Trump started implementing policies that basically denied the right of Americans to visit Cuba, and that my students were affected by these policies. Also, Trump started affecting families. We were denied the right to send money to our families. Western Union was closed in October, I think, and many families started getting affected by the lack of remittances. And this affects Cubans of all backgrounds. It doesn't matter if you are a communist, anti-communist, this affects all Cubans in the island. They are suffering. And it's very sad that in order to overthrow the Cuban government, we are basically trying to asphyxiate the Cuban people. During those months, I tried to call the attention of the White House. I created a petition to President Trump to at least temporarily lift sanctions on Cuba, but he didn't do it. We even pedal and bike from Seattle to Washington, D.C., 3,000 miles to call the attention of the administration of the need of putting to one side political considerations and taking in account human considerations during the pandemic. We talked to Americans from all backgrounds, Republicans, Democrats, and everybody. Actually, I mean, I didn't find anyone in our people, in our country who said it's okay to keep denying the Cubans the right to get remittances. It's okay to close the reunification program. These policies hurt just people. And when I said that everyone, it doesn't matter the political background. It was everyone telling me, you know, this is wrong. We went to Washington, D.C. The president didn't listen to us, but even tried harder to push on the Cuban people, on the Cuban families. President Biden promised that he will lift these anti-family sanctions when he gets the presidency. And we really get our full support to President, then candidate Biden, to lift those sanctions and to get the presidency. We create another petition before he became president, telling President Biden, Senor Biden, when you become president, please fulfill your work, lift those sanctions. Our petition online, mostly signed by Cuban Americans, have more than 20,000 signatures right now, asking basically 6 points. First, reopen embassy in Havana. Second, reopen reunification program closed by Trump. Third, reopen remittances to families. Fourth, reopen the airports in provinces that Trump closed. Fifth, allowed Americans to freely visit Cuba. And sixth, create bridges of law between the two countries and exchange scientific exchange and cooperation between the two countries. What we find now, we find that when Biden came to presidency, we wait and wait and wait, full of hope, telling President Biden, thank you, just fulfill your work. We know that he have many things in his plate, and we were with a lot of patience. After 6 months, and after the situation with the pandemic in Cuba is just desperate, and the Cuban people are desperate because they cannot eat, because they don't have medications. These have created, in part, this situation in Cuba where people are just desperate, going to the street because they cannot stand this no more, these sanctions. And the Cuban government have responsibility in many of the policies in the country, but we have a huge responsibility trying to asphyxiate the Cuban families. And that's the reason, because at the end, in a few weeks ago, we decided to start this pilgrimage. I was say, you know, I'm gonna walk from Miami to Washington, D.C., 1,300 miles, going to communities, talking to everybody that I can, telling what is going on here. Many people in America are not aware of the situation. When you explain that we are not able, in the middle of the pandemic, to send money to our families, they are in shock. We go to churches. We go yesterday to the North Carolina House of Representatives state. We talk to everyone, and everybody agree that these policies are insane, that are affecting Cuban families. These policies didn't work for 60 years because they are impractical and because they are unhuman. And we shouldn't be trying the same recipe again and again and again and again, and the result is gonna be the same. This is,
oh,
yes.
Sorry, I just wanted to say this is a good time for us to, first of all, thank you, because I think you've identified a couple of things that I think we don't usually frame the Cuban conversation as, which is, number one, this is about family separation. Your story is an American story, it's a Cuban story, and it's a story of families being torn apart by policy, right? A long-running, long-standing policy. So foreign policy towards Cuba is actually hurting everyone, right? And the story about travel restrictions is really important, because the last thing you mentioned was that people don't even know that this is happening. We need your caravans to bring sort of an awareness to the society at large. And the other way that we create knowledge is to have exchanges with Cubans where we could actually talk to each other and learn, what are the conditions? What is the reality? right? And so when we have these sort of travel restrictions, this really interferes with our ability to understand what the Cubans want and need, because we're not engaged in real life sort of data collection. So Carlos, we're going to come back to you. I want to make sure we move forward so that we can get everyone to have their presentations. And, you know, you raised Trump, and I think we're going to have Geoff Thale come on now. Geoff is the president of the Washington Office on Latin America, which is WOLA, which a bunch of you know. It's a leading research and advocacy organization advancing human rights in the Americas. He follows hemispheric trends as well as US policy towards the region. And works with senior staff across WOLA's multiple program areas. And Geoff, we welcome you to the discussion to sort of continue what Carlos is saying, but give us a little bit about what Trump's policies really did.
Great, so thank you for that introduction. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I'm really glad to follow Carlos because I think his voice is an important one in this debate. I want to do three quick things. I want to talk, you know, as Dr. Lee suggested, it's important to look at the events of this past weekend and the past few days, which are, you know, an unprecedented level of street demonstrations in Cuba, to look at them contextually and see the different pieces of them. I want to talk about that for a minute, including the steps the previous administration took and kind of where that stands now. I want to talk about, given the events of the last few days, what the US administration has done or not done and what it ought to do. And then a little bit about, and I know Angelica will talk about this more, about kind of what we ought to be urging the administration to do and the kind of ways we can do that. So really quickly, you know, we did see an unprecedented level of demonstrations in Cuba, probably the biggest since the early 60s, clearly driven in some ways by increased internet access and social media. But really, there's sort of a perfect storm of factors that came together here. The Trump administration over 4 years, and especially in the last year, really took aggressive measures to tighten economic sanctions on Cuba. They took efforts, they made efforts to restrict oil deliveries to Cuba. They cut back most US people-to-people travel to Cuba, and the number of US travelers, which had reached something like $600,000 a year, went down really dramatically. They severely limited remittances and cut off to families and cut off the major vehicle for sending remittances to Cuba. They went after the Cuban export of medical services. They changed banking regulations to make third country sales harder. So each of those individual actions, you can debate about the particularities of it and the arguments the Trump administration made for it. Put together, though, the effect of all these measures, and hard not to see the intent of all these measures, was to squeeze the Cuban economy. And in that, I think it's fair to say it succeeded. So you've got that set of measures. The Cuban economy itself has been struggling for years. In 2011, the Cuban government announced what they described as updating the Cuban economy, including moving toward a more mixed economy, expanding small business and the private sector, and trying to make the state sector more efficient. It's certainly fair to say they have moved more slowly on that than they ought to have, and that the Cuban economy is weak as a result. There's no question about that. And then finally, you get the pandemic, and that leads to you know, lockdowns that affect the Cuban economy as they've affected economies elsewhere in the region and in the United States. And in the Cuban case in particular, is an island economy heavily tied to tourism from Canada, from Europe, from Latin America, and people-to-people travel from the United States. You get a big economic impact there. So the result is a perfect storm, right? You've got tightened US sanctions, you've got internal economic difficulties, you've got the pandemic, and I think the result is what we saw last weekend. The kind of a new level of public outcry, a new level of public protests, and what's effectively a demand from the Cuban people for the Cuban government to recognize and do more in response to their immediate situation. Now, the Cuban government's resources are limited. There's no question about that. They don't have hidden pots of money to solve all of these problems, But I think it's important to see that they do need to respond, and they need to respond in a way that's other than repression. I think that's really clear. I think we've seen some signs of that. We need to see more. I think it's probably important for the US and others to call on them to see and do more. On the flip side, and at the same time, for the United States, and this is sort of the second point here, this is not a moment, while the US is certainly right to call for respect for the right to peaceful protests, this is not a moment to try and double down on the Cuban economy and make things worse, nor a time to try and intensify tensions inside Cuba itself. That's, destabilizing situations in Cuba, intensification of sufferings in Cuba certainly doesn't benefit the Cuban people. It certainly doesn't benefit US national interests and US security interests and concerns. It certainly doesn't depend the US business interests that so far this year, mostly in agriculture, have sold Cuba $170 million worth of agricultural goods. So it's a intensifying pressure is a serious mistake and a serious step backward. And what makes more sense, I think, is to do what then candidate Biden first promised to do, which is return to the path of normalization, prioritizing human suffering, and in particular, and in the short term, focusing on aid to the Cuban people. And I think first and foremost, that means enabling remittances that help, as Carlos was saying, help Cuban families meet their daily needs. And while the politics of that are complicated at this moment because of politics in Florida, there is an overwhelming case, it seems to me, from the point of view of US interests and from the point of view of the Cuban people, to return to a path of normalization and specifically and immediately return to the path of permitting remittances that will allow Cuban families to help meet their most immediate needs. It's unfortunate that President Biden said last night he's not prepared to do that right away. And I think it's an important moment to listen to voices like Carlos and listen to voices. There's a range of voices in the Cuban-American community. There's certainly a lot of loud voices at the moment calling for tighter measures, but there are voices like Carlos's and others in the Cuban-American community and among the Cuban people as well, calling for measures that will ease suffering and improve the situation in Cuba. And that's where I think we need to be going. Many of you have probably seen the letter that Senator Leahy and Representative McGovern sent to the president earlier this week, calling for those kind of steps. Angelica, I think we'll talk about this. There's legislation in the Senate that would move toward normalization. I think it's really important that members reach out directly, particularly on the Senate side, but in the House as well, to the White House to convey their concerns about what we're hearing about human suffering in Cuba and the need to respond to that immediately. And I guess with that, I'll wrap up and hand the floor off.
Thank you, Geoff. A lot of very important points that will engage later with what Angelica tells us about legislative initiatives. But what I want to sort of draw a little connection between you and Carlos, Geoff, and this idea that, Carlos started talking about when he first realized our policy may be a little problematic was under George Bush. And you've laid out a case against Trump's escalation, which is, it's not question, without question, Trump escalated the economic tightening on Cuba. Although I would love to engage with you probably later in our lives when we cross paths about, how different is Trump's policy from the actual goals of US foreign policy in Cuba that are longstanding. So when you say now is not the time for escalating the economic sanctions on Cuba, that's definitely true if our goal is to help the Cuban people and to make sure that they have everything they need to survive. But what if our goal is something else? Is that then the exact time that we would tighten the policy if our goal is to do something other than help the Cuban people? And I'm sure this is a very provocative question, as are most questions about Cuba-US policy. And with that, I want to encourage everybody before we move to Jose, please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box so that we can have those ready to go and can get to it efficiently. All right, so we're going to move now to Jose Pertierra, Cuban-American immigration lawyer based in DC. Jose was the lead lawyer in the case of Elian Gonzalez and served as an advisor on one of the high-profile cases of a Cuban prisoner granted clemency by President Obama. He has served as a lawyer and advisor in numerous other cases involving Cubans and Cuba-related affairs, and he's also a columnist. Jose, please take the stage.
Thanks, Tammy, and it's a pleasure to be with such a distinguished panel. I know all of you for many years, and I respect all of you. You know, I'm a Cuban American. I was born in Cuba. I came to this country much earlier in age, not in time, but in age, than Carlos. Carlos came when he was 28, I think you said, Carlos. I came when I was 10. My mother was more anxious to get away from her mother-in-law than she was to get away from the communists. And so she convinced my father that we should immigrate. We landed in Miami, and she was concerned that the mother-in-law would come to Miami because the daughters of my grandmother would be coming to Miami as well. So we went to the office of the Immigration Service, and back then, a lot of people don't know, there was a program to help Cubans, Cuban refugees. The US government would pay one-way fare to anywhere in the United States a Cuban family wanted to go, as long as they promised not to come back to live in Miami. And my mother saw the map that this nice gentleman put on the table, and she looked at it. She saw Miami on the right side, and she looked all the way over to the left, and she said, Jose Ignacio, what is the name of that city over there on the left? I said, it says Los Angeles. And she said, dile al americano que vamos para allá. Tell the American we want to go there. So I grew up in California with a different milieu than in Miami. That I think has affected the way I look at the US-Cuba relations. I don't see it through the prism of Miami. I see it from a different perspective. And I can relate when the entire planet, for the 29th time, voted to condemn the US blockade against Cuba. The only other nation that voted with the United States was Israel. And it's a blockade whose purpose it is to bring about hunger and desperation among people. And that's a violation of international law, and it's also immoral. And when I say that its purpose is to bring about hunger, it's not just my opinion, it's the opinion of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Lester Mallory, who in April of 1960 said it very clearly. He said, the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support in Cuba is through disenchantment and dissatisfaction based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of the government. Following that script, the Trump administration tightened the screws, as you heard Carlos and Geoff say, on the blockade or the so-called embargo. He imposed almost 250 sanctions that effectively cut off remittances from relatives in the United States to their families in Cuba. And you know, the Biden administration has not lifted a single one. Yesterday, the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Policy, Joseph Borrell, affirmed that the decision to suspend remittances influences a situation for which that led to the July 11 situation in Cuba. And I, for one, am absolutely livid that the US government has blocked me from effectively sending money to my wife and daughter in Cuba. They are the victims of Trump and now Biden's Cold War against 12 million people who live in that little island. I think it was Geoff who mentioned a perfect storm. That's exactly what's happened. Scarcity of food and medicines, blackouts that are sometimes prolonged, summer heat that's intense and humid, long lines. My daughter says 6 hours sometimes in lines in the heat. COVID, and Cuba's developed its vaccines, but still, it takes a long time to get away from COVID and get away from the pandemic. Little or no tourism means little or no revenue coming into the country. It's also virtually impossible for Cubans to get visas to come to the US to visit family or even to immigrate to families already living here. There's no escape valve. And let's not kid ourselves, $20 million a year for the purpose of regime change goes a long way to stoke chaos in a country as small as Cuba. It's a perfect storm. And rather than exacerbate the suffering of people on the island, the US government can simply, by lifting the sanctions that Trump imposed, can return to the US policy that President Obama designed. And we see all these images of what happened on July 11th. Many of them are fake. We got to be careful. You see pictures of what's supposedly happening in Havana, but there are pictures of what happened in Egypt, or pictures of what happened in Argentina or in Barcelona. There's even pictures of government supporters, including one of the Cuban Five, Gerardo, as if he was protesting the Cuban government. And these things are being done purposely to stoke chaos. And so you think there's more happening than there really is happening. I remember when I first got to the United States, there was a record going around called El Día que se cayó Fidel, the day that Fidel fell. And everybody was stoked in Miami because Fidel was going to fall any moment now. There was even a contest on the radio. If you bring in a kid who can sing a Cuban bolero the best, the family gets a one-way ticket back to Cuba. And the father brought a little girl, and she began to sing a famous Cuban bolero, En el tronco de un árbol, una niña, and she says, "Oh, daddy, I forgot the rest." So what I mean to say with that is people have assimilated to the United States. And the Cuban government is not going to fall tomorrow. It's going to be there. If anything, this so-called crisis is stoking the possibility of mass illegal immigration to the United States. Mark Frank said the other day, Mark Frank is a reporter for Reuters who's in Cuba. He says, Biden tells the big lie that Cuba is a failed state to appease Miami Cubans who believe the big lie that he's not a legitimate president. Go figure.
Jose.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure we get Angelica in, but there's some things I want us to revisit, and they're coming up in Q&A that are directly related to your presentation so far. One of them will be about, remittances, but also what I wanted to say to you before we transition to Angelica is, there's a thing that we do when we're in the US and we're looking at Cuba, and that is to look at them and expect them to be a perfect society and a perfect government. They're not allowed to have any sort of protest. They're not allowed to have any of the things that all governments have to deal with. And so you're pointing out something very important about the coverage of what's going on at this moment, which is whose voices are being amplified here? Which opinions are those shared widely? How can we verify that information? And so there's a question to that that's directly in the chat. I also want to tie you to Geoff for a second in terms of you've read some of the original intent and motivation for US foreign policy against Cuba from the 60s, right? And you said that Trump's escalation followed that script. That was the original point of the policy, US policy against Cuba. I want all the panelists to sort of think about, is Biden's inaction part of the script? Yeah, so it's just continued the same sort of approach to relations, but changing presidencies doesn't seem to change the actual intent of and the spirit of US foreign policy. So let's debate that later. Why don't we get to Angelica, because she is definitely going to take us through what's going on legislatively So let me introduce her. Angelica Salazar is a member of the steering committee of ACERE, which is the Alliance for Cuban Engagement and Respect. She's a longtime advocate and policy expert in Cuba and US Cuba relations. Angelica has facilitated dozens of educational people-to-people delegations. And for those of you who don't know, that's one of the lawful ways in which we might, as US citizens, travel to Cuba. And she's directed academic study abroad programs for US university students at the University of Havana. Angelica, please take the stage.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Amy, good friend of mine. Good morning, buenos dias. I want to first thank all of you joining us today for taking the time out of your busy schedules to learn more about this critical issue. I'm going to share with you some ways you and your boss can help alleviate the suffering of the Cuban people, as you all have heard the testimonies from Jose and Carlos about what they're currently experiencing, and also how ACERE can assist you as a resource. But briefly, a little bit about me. I've been devoted for the last 20 years of my life to organizing advocacy efforts to normalize US-Cuba relations. And it's quite an honor and full circle to be sharing a mic with Geoff Thale, former boss of mine. We worked together during the first Obama term when I moved to Washington to join a national coalition of BC-based organizations, including WOLA, CDA, LOG, and others. And I had the opportunity to educate and mobilize the grassroots, your constituent advocates, specifically in legislative efforts to change US policies towards Cuba. So we've been doing this for a long time. And my commitment to this issue is really grounded and motivated by my long-term friendships I have with the Cuban people on the island and in the diaspora. And many of them have become more like family to me. On my first trip to the island, I was a teenager in the mid-90s, just right after the special period. And I was struck as a young person seeing the poverty and the hardships, but also the resilience of the Cuban people. And since then, over the last 25 years, in my own journey back and forth to the island as a facilitator of these educational people-to-people programs with young people to educators to US judges, and also being on the ground with US university students during their semester-long study abroad programs, we have experienced countless exchanges with everyday common Cuban people. And we've listened a lot. We've listened to their lived experiences, their hardships, their frustrations, their joys, their dreams and hopes for the future. These very exchanges of ideas and values and finding common ground as two peoples are the fundamentals to building US-Cuba diplomacy. As I continue to learn and try to make sense of Cuba, I'm constantly reminded, es complicado. It's a complicated place. However, there's one thing very clear. US policies directly and gravely impact the lives of everyday Cubans in every possible way, in every possible level, especially during this global pandemic. So before I go on to share some thoughts on how your boss can help alleviate the suffering of the Cuban people, I would like to highlight a few of ACERE's most recent initiatives and provide some background on the work that we do. As Tammy mentioned, ACERE was formed to help harness the energy of tens of thousands of grassroots constituent advocates across the country to help have an impact on the federal level. Our alliance includes a coalition of nearly 50 local, regional, and national organizations and countless individual activists across the country, including probably some that are in your districts. Last year, we made a big push for an amendment vote to remove restrictions on family remittances and on the FSGG financial services approach bill, with 100 organizations across the country endorsing this effort. We generated hundreds of calls and emails in support, though ultimately Congressman McGovern asked Congressman Ruff to hold off on the vote at that time. Shortly after President Biden's inauguration, ACERE also helped to advise and support a letter to President Biden, led by Congress members Rush, Lee, Cohen, and Moore. Thank you all very much. And we got 80 congressional signatures, including more than 10 key committee chairs to sign on to that letter that was signed and delivered to President Biden. That timely letter was a huge and early signal to the president that the Congress is going to continue to seek a return to the Obama approach. ACERE has also worked closely with current and former staffers like yourselves who have experience and can help make your workload lighter if you're interested in helping move US policies towards Cuba in the right direction. We are available. Please feel free to reach out at any time, and we are open to brainstorm together initiatives that your boss can lead. What can Congress do now to help support the Cuban people? As outlined in that letter signed by 80 members and also in WOLA and CDA's report, The Roadmap to Change in US Cuba Policy, President Biden can revoke nearly all of the Trump restrictions with the stroke of a pen by an executive order. In recent days, numerous members have tweeted and put out statements recognizing the Cuban people's right to protest and acknowledging their hardships, but also responding by calling on President Biden to revoke the harsh Trump sanctions so Cubans can get immediate relief in the midst of this health and economic crisis. Our team can provide you with great sample tweets, language so that you can use those that are balanced statements that call for human rights to be respected, but also asking Biden to take the right actions and to provide immediate relief. Reps McGovern and Lee just sent a letter, an urgent letter to Biden on this very topic, requesting an in-person meeting and outlined similar policy recommendations, as Geoff mentioned. Whatever you do, whether it's a tweet, a statement, a letter to Biden, it's very important to help us let the president know that Congress is not in support of failed policies and that we cannot punish innocent Cubans anymore. We have to be outspoken on this issue. And also, Congress has repeatedly in this last year addressed the economic suffering of the Cuban people. They've shown their leadership on this issue. So here are some of the specific related legislations that have been introduced in this current congressional session. We have a bill introduced by Rep. Rush, the United States Cuba Relations Act in the House. That's bill number HR 3625. And in the Senate, Senator Klobuchar recently introduced the Freedom to Export to Cuba Act. That's S 1694. This is the second Senate bill introduced earlier this year by the Finance Chair Committee Wyden, was the United States Cuba Trade Act, S249. And we can also send you all these bill numbers and the bill text as well. Many senators and House members live in agricultural states. Both of these pieces of legislation in the Senate would greatly boost US exports of USA-made goods to Cuba and help support US American businesses and farmers, especially during these economic hard times in our own country. If your boss is in an agriculture state, we are also hoping to generate a bipartisan agricultural focused sign-on letter. Cubans are hungry, you're hearing them. And why not allow US businesses and farmers to easily sell to them? Please let us know how we can help support and assist you co-leading in these spaces. In the past Congresses, there has been legislation introduced to allow US farmers to more easily sell their produce to Cuba, which would create, again, lots of jobs in the United States. This is not a partisan issue. One example is in 2017, Representative Crawford introduced the Cuba Agricultural Export Act, HR 525, that had 66 bipartisan co-sponsors. And as you all know, there's a lot of US polls out. The majority of US Americans want their constitutional right to travel. And we understand that our longtime champs on Cuba policy, Rep. McGovern and Senator Leahy, will reintroduce their companion bills, the Freedom to Travel to Cuba Act. We will keep you updated as new legislation comes out. And we are asking that your bosses co-sponsor these bills. And lastly, since it is a probe season, we are hoping to again seek a vote to end the restriction on family remittances on the FSGG bill. And we think this is an issue that is a no-brainer. It's a humanitarian issue. Every family deserves the right to support their family when they fall on hard times. We are hopeful that the chairman of the Rules, Rep. McGovern, will also help us get this vote. And we, of course, would appreciate your bosses supporting the Cuban families' freedom to help their relatives via remittances in the event that it does come to the floor this year. But again, we are working closely with current and former legislative staffers who can help you in creating successful products in Congress, letters, amendment votes, legislation. And so if you have interest in taking a lead in part of these issues, please reach out and we could explore this a space that you and your boss can lead in. In conclusion, we respectfully encourage all of you to lift up these Cuba-related bills for your bosses to co-sponsor. The Cuban people need us to act now. The situation is dire and you can help. ACERE is here, as is WOLA, as a resource to you. So thank you for your time and your important work on this issue.
Thank you, Angelica. You know, there's no good conference or presentation without a call to action. And so we really thank you all for your time, for listening. We're going to do a Q&A. We've got some great questions in Q&A, so please stick with us. But I want to encourage Angelica, if you can, type the names of the bills and the sponsoring offices in the chat for the attendees. And we'll move into the questions that are coming in. We're going to start with one which Carlos has answered in part. If you go to the Q&A tab and go to the answered section, you'll see Carlos's answer to the question, which is, what are the implications of the US ending their sanctions on Cuba for both countries? Carlos has taken his time to write an answer. I'm going to invite him to also move that if he'd like to verbally, but then I want to open that question to the rest of the panel. What are the implications of the US ending their sanctions on Cuba for both countries? Carlos, do you want to add something to what you wrote there?
I wrote something very brief, something that I just remember, but to see what would be the future if we change the sanctions and we leave the sanctions, we just can go to the past. In the same way that if you establish the same policies in the past and we repeat the same recipe, the results are going to be the same. Well, in the past, in the recent past, we have the Obama administration that changed and leave some sanctions. And what were the results for Cuba, for the Cuban people? Business flourished in Cuba. People start going outside the country. People start having more opportunities. And that opportunity were not just for the business, but for everyone related to that. People acquired new ideas, more independence, and it was great for Cubans to be in contact with ideas in the world and also to have a better life because they get more resources, they access to income from tourism. For Americans, and just talking here about a little bit about what I can see, I saw that firsthand because I took students to Cuba. I took parents from my communities to Cuba. For Americans, they have the access to go there and see with their own eyes what was going on. They have the opportunity to be ambassadors of our American values. American business also benefits. Cruise lines went to Cuba, take Americans over there, and they make money. See, hotels that got licensed to operate in Cuba make money too. Many, and also around the world, many countries who opposed to the embargo saw the leadership that the United States was taking on this moment as something to be praised. And and the alliances that we have around the world get strengthened just due to the United States being online with in line doing the right thing for the Cuban people and for the American people.
Geoff, do you have anything to add? You know, we're calling or ask, I think all of us are asking for the US to end the embargo and lessen and remove the sanctions. What do you think will happen? You're muted.
There we go. Sorry. So clearly we ought to end the embargo. We ought to move toward full normalization of relations. If we did so, I think that would be good for the Cuban people. I think it'd be good for US business interests, for US travelers and tourists, for US commercial interests, and for US national security. I do want to say, I think the most important thing right at this moment is to take immediate steps to address the situation in Cuba. And I think the priority there is remittances. I think the real pressure point there is the administration. While we can see whether there are opportunities and appropriations this year, I think really pushing, especially in the Senate, pushing on the administration on that issue is really key.
Yes,
Okay, Geoff, I have another, I know, yeah, I
Tammy,
want
before
Jose
you
to
get to that
answer.
other question, I would
Yeah,
like to do the flip side of,
Okay.
of the question you posed to Carlos and Jeff. What if we don't lift sanctions?
Thank you.
Right now, the Biden administration has taken a huge political hit about the immigration that's coming in from Central America on the border. And its reaction to alleviate that illegal immigration on the border is to send money for the infrastructure of Central American countries so that people in Central America are not desperate to leave. But in the case of Cuba, the US is choking the Cuban economy, choking the Cuban people, lack of remittances, no visas, so many sanctions that Cuba can't even deposit dollars, all in the middle of a pandemic. Well, guess what? That may precipitate massive illegal immigration by Cubans to the United States in boats and rafts. And how's that going to be for a political hit on Biden? So I think the Democratic Party should think long and hard about following these Trump policies with respect to Cuba for its own good. Even if they don't care about Cuba and the Cuban people, if they care about their own political future, they ought to lift those sanctions.
I want to add something, 30 seconds, to what Jeff added. What could, how can America and Cuba benefit from this in the sense of families? Cuban families right now are denying the human right to receive help from their families, and they are Cubans. Cuban-American families, Americans, are being denied of the human right to visit and to help their families by sending money and by supporting them. And what a better way to help both countries that Cuban Americans and Cubans in the island benefit the family just for the lifting of the prohibition on remittances to Western Union.
I mean, and let's be honest, let's just be strictly humanitarian about it. If we don't lift these sanctions during a global pandemic, people will die. I mean, let's just be really honest about it. You know, they don't have syringes. They don't have the basic needs during a global pandemic, right? The embargo is making that worse. Angelica, I see you nodding. Do you want to weigh in on this, or can I move to a question about remittances?
No, just fully agreeing. It's, you know, okay. I'm heavy-hearted about this. I hear from my Cuban family and friends every day on the island, and you're absolutely right. It's that dire, Tammy.
It is. My WhatsApp is just really scary about what people need and don't have. But let's move on to a specific question about remittances that I think we've got a great panel to answer. Geoff, can you really pay attention to this one? Because I think this is, you know, something that you can answer. The question is, can you confirm that the Cuban government does not tax remittances? With that being the case, what is the argument against allowing them? Allowing them promotes independence from the government and is a pro-family and humanitarian move. That's from Christopher.
So this is so the simple answer is the Cuban government doesn't tax remittances. The remittance question is actually fairly complicated. Remittances until last year were either hand carried or sent through Western Union. The Trump administration canceled the license for Western Union to work with its Cuban partner. And so right now you cannot send remittances any way other than having an individual carry dollars for you. So that's a huge limitation. The Cuban government used to tax dollars, all dollars, remittances, tourist dollars, used to tax all dollars. They ended that last year. And so while there may be a banking fee on the Cuban side, just as there's a banking fee at Western Union, there's no direct Cuban tax on remittances to Cuba.
Carlos and Jose, have you had anything that doesn't comport?
I want to make, one of the arguments is that the money that people receive in the past was CUCs or this kind of Cuban dollars that were different to the currency that Cuba used. Now they are no longer using the CUC. They are using national pesos, whatever. But the point here is just denying the remittances. I mean, there is not even the will to say, okay, let's go. We'll send the money to the Cuban families and the Cuban government. Let's agree that it's going to give the dollars to the families. That option is not there. When you bring this point to the equation, then the people opposed of this say that, but they are going to spend the money in the dollar stores, and still it's going to end up in the Cuban government. Well, those are the stores that they have to buy things over there right now with a pandemic, right? Then the point here really, and I think that that's the point, is basically denying remittance as a whole, even when the justification could be that this tax that is going to be spent on the Cuban stores, it doesn't matter. If we come to the agreement that the Cuban government, I assume, will give the money directly to the people in dollars, still there won't be a movement in that direction. Hopefully, yes, but I'm sure that the position on this is cut remittances to starve Cubans and make them desperate and provoke what is happening right now.
Jose, did you want to comment before we move to our last
briefly,
question?
that the issue of taxes on remittances is a red herring. I mean, what they want is to prevent remittances from going to Cuba. They know that because of the pandemic, people are not traveling to Cuba, so they've weaponized the pandemic, and it's a further attempt to choke the Cuban people so that they will supposedly rebel. And as I said before, they're not going to rebel, they're going to emigrate.
Okay, Angelica, I'm going to ask one final question, but do you want to weigh in on the remittance?
No, I mean, I disagree. I mean, we could talk all day about remittances and how it benefits directly the Cuban people. And I would actually say it benefits the private enterprise, the small businesses in Cuba, right? Which is, you know, what our policy hopes to do. And so, yeah, it's just, it's an incredible critical issue that we're able to get money down there to people who need it now.
So unless, thank you, Angelica. Unless someone from ACERE wants to correct me in the chat, I think we're running, this is about the end of our time. I wanna have one last question, which I think is really important from Benjamin. And then, so just one last question that everyone should comment on. And then if you want to add a few words to wrap up, I think that would be a great way to end the conversation. Okay, so let me ask Benjamin's question and then I'll get back to you on how much time we have. Benjamin's question is, what are some sources that can be relied on for on-the-ground information about the current protests? US-based media is far too often reporting from a specific perspective that makes it difficult to find objective and properly contextualized information. A specific example, some small media outlets claim that a quote, independent and adversarial quote perspective are reporting that there are pro-government demonstrations throughout Cuba, but so far I have no way of verifying the veracity of those claims. So in sum, where do people go to find out what's really going on the ground in Cuba?
Tammy, I don't think there's a single source. I think you just got to fish around. There's $20 million a year that has been used to weaponize, among other things, social media to create cows, much like the Trump people did in the United States and are doing in the United States. You put out so much fake news, nobody knows what's true and what's false. And you just have to navigate around the social media and even around corporate media. I mean, I don't think there's a single source.
Okay, anyone else?
Yes, okay, go ahead, Angelica.
Dale, Carlos.
Okay, I think I agree with Jose. Right now, many Cubans in the United States, for instance, they get their news from Cubita Now, from U.S Cuba, from different independent sources. that at the same time have been paid by our tax money to make work on Cuba. And whatever they put there is not verified news, is not real journalism. But we are living in a post-truth era where if you bomb people with many news, people are incapable of react and they are full of emotions with whatever you put there. And it's really difficult to know. On the other hand, if you go to the Cuban government, it's also one side. And then it's very difficult for the people to know what is going on, especially right now. I have seen so many fake news during these days that I just opt out to not look into anything of that. And unfortunately, the corporate media is also influenced by this and by the narrative of just work and the narrative of the same narrative that is fed by the media and by the lies. And it's very difficult to know what is going on.
Angelica, would you like to add anything?
No, I mean, just a brief mention. I mean, just yesterday I got contacted by a young Cuban-born former congressional staffer, and the same thing, heavy-hearted, completely overwhelmed by what she was witnessing on social media, but very grounded in understanding that it's hard to get factual, data-based information when it comes to Cuba because it's so polarized and politicized. And so, you know, it's really important to understand where your sources come from, especially if there is some kind of funding attached to why it's being developed. And so, yeah, I mean, as staffers, you know, take time, listen before reacting as well.
Carlos.
I just want to make one more point, and I'm sorry. For example, for the last year, we have been doing caravans in Miami. We start with 7 people there, Protestón Cubano. Nowadays, the caravan, we have more than 300 marching in caravans. We inform to the Miami Herald, to the media in Miami about these caravans of hundreds of Cuban-Americans in the city of Miami asking for the lifting of the embargo, and the media there does not report anything. The last time, the 27th, when we depart over here, hundreds of Cubans were with us there chanting and having a party because we were walking 1,300 miles, and the media was in the other side of the protesters, who were like 25 people, and we were not reported. It was just completely biased. It's very difficult.
I've got some thoughts as
At the same time they do that, Carlos, they have no problem publicizing that President Biden and Vice President Harris are communists or socialists.
Oh, yeah. Pick a lane, yeah. I've got some comments from an academic perspective on that, but I noticed that Geoff needs to leave us, and I want to give him some final words before he goes. And we're going to stay on a little bit because I guess, you know, there's a lot of folks still on the call, so we'll take questions until we run out of time. But Geoff,
thank you all for the invitation. Thanks to all of I see there's 60 to 70 people participating, so that's really great. I think there's been a lively conversation and has really focused on trying to actually understand what's happening in Cuba. What would be the most constructive thing for the U.S. to do in terms of the Cuban people, the humanitarian situation, as well as, you know, genuine U.S. interest. And so I think this has been really helpful, and thank you all.
Thank you so much, Geoff. We'll see you around, and thank you for your work. Before we move to the next question, I wanted to answer as an academic on what sources that we should be looking at. You know, part of the reasons why these travel restrictions and the sanctions are so bad is that it prevents us, folks in the academic world and in the journalism world, for actually getting that information to you. Right? It is really hard to be able to get approved to go over to Cuba, to do your research, and to do it deeply enough to actually understand and be embedded in the communities and in their organizations to see how it actually works, right? And so even our academics have been polarized by who has access to the island and who doesn't. So, you know, if we want to have clear and valid information, this is even another reason why we need to work on travel restrictions and economic sanctions. I want to bring Elena's question to the remaining panelists. She says, given the lack of action and response from Biden administration, what are some concrete actions that members of the panel can suggest for activists working to end the blockade?
Join Carlos.
Okay.
We're laughing, but we're serious.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, people are descending on Washington on the 25th to join Carlos. And people are organizing locally. Go ahead.
Yeah, Elena is a friend and is also an activist for the lifting of these sanctions. And even when the political rhetoric right now suggests that many Cuban Americans are against the lifting of the sanctions, I want to remind Elena that during the last year, she has been participating in caravans that start with 10 people, and now we are hundreds, and now we took the streets of Miami. This could be like a setback because all the political rhetoric that is going on, but the majority of the Cuban Americans support the lifting of the sanctions for families, and they want bridges of love between our countries. What can we do? Keep fighting, keep aiding our grievances, keep doing what we have been doing, that we are in the right track, and we will win this fight for the Cuban families.
Thank you. We lost Geoff, but I want to get to Cindy's question, which she wanted Geoff to answer, but I'm sure he'll answer it in his private time, Cindy, if you contact him. But Carlos is on, and maybe he wants to take a stab. Cindy says, I fully support ending the restriction on remittances, financial transactions, etc. But is there enough supply in the Cuban market for people to buy to put food on the table? How do we address the larger humanitarian crisis and hardships raised in the protest?
Two things. The first
and thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Cindy, for your hard work.
Sorry, two things. The first one, is there enough supply? Let's find out. If the people having the money, they find the food to buy. If the farmers have the way to produce and sell the produce. Let us not be stopped by, we are not going to send that money because how they are going to use it. I'm sure that no Cuban is going to tell you, don't send me money, brother or sister, because there is nothing to buy here. That's a first thing. I'm sure that there are ways, and people, when they get the money, they will find ways to use it, and that money will spread around. The second question, how do we address the larger humanitarian crisis and hardship raised into the protests? I don't know about that. I don't know how we address this. I think that the best way is lifting the embargo and allowing the Cubans to succeed, to achieve their potential. But in the meantime, and our organization, Bridges of Love, sometimes we don't have the power to affect the whole society, but we affect one family at the time. We affect one citizen at the time. And that change, that little change, that grain of change in the world provoke other changes. Then that's what moves. I have the testimony of my students during the tornado in Cuba 2 years ago, that they raised $4,500 to help communities, and they went to neighborhoods and they donated the money and they donated food. And when they came back, they said, well, but that doesn't affect the whole Cuban population. That doesn't change the world. Well, it doesn't change the world, but it changed the world of many people, of many families that are grateful of this American who extend their hand in times of need. Let's do it at least one at a time, one family at a time.
Jose, you've got thoughts? Angelica has her hand up.
Tamara, and I have to also leave because I have a consultation now, but I want to add one thing. We've talked about food and the scarcity of food. We talked about the scarcity of money. We haven't talked about the scarcity of medicine.
Right.
And medicines are scarce in Cuba. Blood pressure medicine, heart medicine, aspirin, you can't find it. And the reason is, Cuba imports it. And to import medicine or food, you have to have money. And if you choke off the money, then Cuba can't purchase those things, and that's why they're scarce.
I mean, that's the larger humanitarian crisis
That's
itself.
exactly right. So, you know, it's a big problem. In the olden days, people would take medicine, but you can't, because of the pandemic, there are no flights going. Well, there are flights, but there's one flight a week, I think, out of Miami. And it's very difficult to get into Cuba unless you've been fully vaccinated, and you have to do quarantine. So, you know, people don't want to go for 2 weeks if they have to be quarantined for a week.
Yeah.
It's tough, and the United States needs to address the humanitarian needs of the Cuban people. I remember during the Clinton administration, there was a relaxing of sanctions during particular crisis. And I think this president, if he's wants to present himself as different from Trump and not just Trump light, he needs to lift the sanctions that Trump imposed. If he doesn't want to lift the blockade, lift the sanctions that Trump imposed, and go back to the policies that were in existence when he himself was vice president of the United States.
Yeah, and failure to do so.
Been a pleasure being with all of you and with the staffers that I haven't met. Good luck, and see you next time. Carlos, I'll see you on the 25th right here in Washington. We'll be marching with you.
Yes, thank you.
Bye, Jose. Que tenga buen día.
Igualmente.
Gracias, Jose. Un abrazo.
Un abrazo para ustedes.
Okay, so I've gotten a signal that we should wrap up. So what I want to do is give both Carlos and Angelica. Let's do Carlos first, and then Angelica, you can reissue a call to action, and then we'll let you all go about your day. And thank you so much for your time. Carlos, final words.
Yes, I want to, for the members of Congress, for the American people, in the middle of this situation, in the middle of a pandemic, not just to see this from the political point, from the political stand that how this will benefit me during the next election. Look inside your hearts. Check inside your hearts. Go and to the side of the life for left and right is divided between people who love and those who hate. And I ask you, I encourage you, Americans, members of Congress, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, look in your heart, think about the families that are suffering in Cuba. And for a moment, when you see that they cannot receive money, they cannot receive anything in the middle of the pandemic, then think just for a moment that that's your family. And what would you do? That's what my word for that.
Thank you, Carlos. Angelica.
Yeah, I mean, as a good ending to this call to action, I'm going to go back to Elena's question about how, you know, regular US Americans can help the Cuban people. There are two things I'm going to mention. There is an active campaign right now that has been happening specifically to raise funds for syringes to Cuba. I'm going to try to post the flyer in the chat, but also you can reach us at the Alliance for Cuba at ACERE.org. And I'm happy to share any resources that we've mentioned on this call and much more. So again, there's an active campaign happening to raise funds for syringes to Cuba. Cuba has their own COVID-19 vaccine. And I'm also going to throw a link into the chat, a documentary done by a Cuban neuroscientist, produced by a Cuban neuroscientist and a British academic. And they, during the pandemic, while the country was closed, were able to get interviews with everyday Cubans all the way to the scientists who have developed these Cuban-made vaccines. The problem is they don't have syringes. And so that's why it's really important, just a simple act of helping to donate for syringes for, you know, the Cuban population to get vaccine. I mean, it's a huge act, and it's an act of love. And that's what we are here sharing with all of you today, because we are really doing this work because we have to build bridges of love, and we hope you join us on this bridge.
Thank you both so much, and thank you to the panelists who've already left. Thank you all for your interest and for your patience. I hope you learned what you needed to learn. I hope you got the links that you need, and I hope you listen to the organizations as they reach out to you in these really, really critical days about getting the administration to do something that could directly help the Cuban people. Thank you all. Angelica, I'm giving us a little time for Angelica to put all of her things in the chat. If you can't follow the chat or you're running out, go to ACERE's website. You can see their letters, policies, all these things that they're fighting for. It's a great resource and hub for finding out about Cuban information about what's going on in Cuba. Okay, thanks everybody. We've got 10 seconds, so let's just wave our goodbyes.
God
Please help
bless
us
everyone.
help Cuba.